The old train station had been abandoned for decades. Rusted tracks stretched into the distance, leading nowhere, as the once bustling platform lay in silence. But every night at midnight, the sound of a train could be heard echoing through the empty corridors. It was said that the train carried the souls of the damned, cursed to ride the rails for eternity. One stormy night, John, a young man who had always been fascinated by the supernatural, decided to investigate the rumors. Armed with a flashlight and a digital recorder, he made his way to the station. The wind howled through the broken windows, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. As the clock struck midnight, the sound of the train's whistle pierced the silence. The ground trembled as if something massive was approaching. John's heart raced as he saw the ghostly outline of a train materializing on the tracks. It was an ancient steam engine, its metal body covered in soot and grime. The windows were black, hiding whatever horrors might lurk inside. Without thinking, John stepped closer, compelled by a force he couldn't explain. The train screeched to a halt before him, and the door to the first carriage creaked open. A cold, icy hand seemed to grip John's spine, urging him to step aboard. Unable to resist, he climbed the steps and entered the carriage. The door slammed shut behind him, and the train began to move. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of sulfur and burning coal. The seats were filled with shadowy figures, their faces twisted in agony. They were the lost souls, trapped in an endless journey, never to find peace. As John walked down the aisle, he felt their hollow eyes following him, their whispers echoing in his mind. Suddenly, the train lurched forward, and the lights flickered. The walls of the carriage began to close in, the metal groaning as it constricted around him. John's breath came in short gasps as he realized he was being pulled into the very essence of the train, becoming one with the cursed souls. With a final, desperate scream, John vanished, his voice swallowed by the relentless roar of the train. The Midnight Express continued its journey through the night, the whispers of the damned growing louder as it carried yet another lost soul into the darkness. The train vanished into the fog, leaving the station as silent as it had been before. Only the faintest echo of a whistle remained, a haunting reminder of the horrors that lay beyond the veil of reality. And those who dared to venture near the tracks knew that the train would always return at midnight, searching for the next soul to claim. The fog rolled back over the deserted station, shrouding the rusted tracks in a thick, impenetrable mist. But the legend of the midnight train began to spread, whispered among those who had lived in the town for years and those who had just arrived, drawn by the eerie stories of the past. A month after John's disappearance, his younger sister, Emily, arrived at the station. She was determined to find out what had happened to her brother. She didn't believe in ghosts or cursed trains, but John's disappearance had left her with no other choice but to search for answers. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she made her way to the platform. It was a cold, moonless night, and the only light came from her small, flickering flashlight. The old station was even more dilapidated than she had imagined, with ivy crawling up the walls and broken glass crunching beneath her boots. She reached the tracks just as the clock struck midnight. The familiar whistle echoed through the night, and the ground shook beneath her feet. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw the same ghostly train her brother had seen. The steam engine materialized out of the fog, its metal hissing and groaning as it came to a stop in front of her. The door to the first carriage opened with a loud creak, inviting her inside. But unlike her brother, Emily hesitated. She could feel the cold presence of the souls trapped within the train, their sorrow and anger reaching out to her. Her instinct screamed at her to run, to leave this cursed place and never return. But Emily had made a promise to herself that she would find John, no matter what it took. Steeling her nerves, she stepped aboard the train, the door slamming shut behind her with a finality that made her shiver. Inside, the carriage was exactly as John had described in his recordings. The air was thick with the smell of burning coal, and the shadowy figures filled the seats, their hollow eyes fixed on her. But this time, something was different. The train wasn't moving. It was as if it were waiting for something or someone. Emily walked down the aisle, her footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. As she passed each seat, the figures turned to face her, their whispers growing louder. They spoke in a language she couldn't understand, but their desperation was clear. They were trapped, but not by the train alone. At the end of the carriage, Emily found a door that hadn't been there before. It was ancient, made of dark wood with strange symbols carved into it. She reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the cold surface. The symbols began to glow, and the door slowly creaked open, revealing a long, dark corridor. Emily stepped through, feeling as though she was crossing a threshold between worlds. The corridor was lined with doors, each one identical to the last. As she walked past them, she could hear faint cries and whispers from behind them, as if the souls trapped within were begging to be freed. At the end of the corridor, she found another door. This one was different. It was newer, less worn, and had a brass handle that gleamed in the dim light. She opened it, her heart pounding with fear and anticipation. Inside was a small room, empty except for a single chair facing a mirror. In the chair sat John. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. He didn't seem to notice Emily's presence, his gaze locked on the mirror in front of him. Emily rushed to him, calling his name, but he didn't respond. It was as if he was trapped in a trance, unable to hear or see her. She shook him, but it was no use. His body was there, but his soul was somewhere else, lost within the mirror. Desperate, Emily looked into the mirror. Instead of her reflection, she saw a dark, endless void, swirling with shadows and faces that seemed to reach out to her. The mirror was a portal, a gateway to wherever the souls of the damned were kept, and John's soul was among them. Emily knew what she had to do. She reached out, touching the surface of the mirror. It was cold and slick, like ice, but she pressed her hand against it, determined to pull her brother back. The moment her fingers made contact, she was pulled into the mirror, the room around her dissolving into darkness. She felt herself falling, spinning through the void, the voices of the damned screaming in her ears. The shadows reached out, clawing at her, trying to pull her into their depths. But Emily fought back, calling out to John with all her strength. She could feel his presence, faint and distant, but it was there. She reached out, her fingers brushing against something solid in the darkness. Suddenly, the void shattered, and Emily was back in the room, the mirror cracked and broken. She gasped for breath, her body trembling with exhaustion. But John was still in the chair, his eyes closed, his face peaceful. Slowly, his eyes fluttered open. He looked at Emily, confused at first, but then recognition dawned, and he threw his arms around her, tears streaming down his face. He was free. The train shuddered, the walls of the carriage creaking as it began to move again. But this time, Emily and John were no longer its prisoners. They hurried down the aisle, past the shadowy figures who seemed to watch them with approval, their whispers fading into silence. They reached the door just as the train pulled into the station. The moment they stepped off the platform, the train vanished into the fog, leaving only the rusted tracks behind. Emily and John stood there, holding on to each other as the first light of dawn broke through the mist. They had escaped the midnight train, but they knew that the curse would continue, searching for the next soul to claim. But they had each other, and that was enough. As they walked away from the station, Emily glanced back one last time. The fog was lifting, revealing the empty platform and the rusted tracks that led into the distance. And for a moment, just a moment, she thought she saw the ghostly outline of a train fading into the mist, its whistle echoing softly in the morning air.